Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast and newsletter all about how generative AI is changing the media, journalism, and the news. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and on this podcast, I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people helping build the AI-driven workplaces of the future. I'm excited to welcome to the Media Copilot podcast, Eric Wengrowski. Eric is the CEO of Steg.AI, a company that specializes in forensic watermarking for information security. One of the biggest issues in generative AI is content provenance, especially how do you check where information is originally coming from? This is a big deal in using content as training data in AI models, and I'm really excited to get Eric's thoughts on the subject, as well as his perspective on the state of generative AI today. Eric, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Thanks, Pete. Nice to be here.
Cool. Well, listen, I think a lot of my listeners might not be all that familiar with digital watermarking. Can you give me just sort of the 411 elevator pitch, the basics of what it is and what Steg.AI does?
Sure. So watermarking and steganography are really old technologies and art forms. So steganography is literally just the process of hiding information concealed in another medium. And it's been a tool of information exchange, even warfare for a long time now. For that reason, it's confusing to talk about watermarking and steganography because it means so many different things. But Steg.AI is a forensic watermarking company. And what I mean by that is we have technology to embed information in digital files, images, videos, documents, what have you, that is virtually imperceptible to people, but perceptible to our algorithms. And they're really, it's sturdy. So you can take, a coded image, compress it, crop it, all these different types of manipulations and edits, and still read what we have here.
So I feel like just to throw out a basic use case for this, it's kind of like you hear about sometimes in Hollywood, they'll give either screener copies of things or scripts or something like that out to select people, and they want to keep it secret. So they'll actually watermark each and every copy. So if anything leaks, they'll know at very least like who leaked it or which copy got leaked, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when I say watermarks, I don't mean like pictures that have, Shutterstock or some text on it. It's all, invisible.
Okay, cool. And so then what specifically within that field does Steg.AI specialize in?
So Steg has developed a new type of watermarking technology called light field messaging. And it's all based on deep learning. Everybody talks about machine learning, deep learning, AI. I know it's very buzzy right now, but it's really at the core of our products. And what it allows us to do is make watermarks that are stronger and better looking, faster, can hold more information. So, you can think about it like, there was kind of without getting too technical, the fixed filter watermarking that was popularized in the 90s.
Okay.
Some of the DCT methods.
Not familiar, but what...
without getting too much into it. But the deep learning approach that we have is kind of unlocked like a big couple of advancements in what we're able to do with our watermarks.
Okay. And like, what's that exactly? And what are those advancements? And, are we talking about images, videos, text, all of it? Do you guys specialize in any particular media?
Talking about all of it. All of it. Yeah, our earliest algorithms were all images, but we moved on to video after that, documents. Yeah, we're talking about all of it. I'd say the big change is just having the ability to watermark, digital assets such that they can go through, really intense manipulations, edits, changes, and we can still read the watermark. We kind of got, our first notoriety was when we developed a method for watermarking through the analog channel, which means that, I could take an image, I could watermark it, I could then like put it on a TV screen and take a picture of it with my iPhone camera, and my iPhone could read the watermark. So it was almost like being able to turn images into invisible QR codes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a good way to think about it. And I've noticed on your site, you're not just purely an individual play or an enterprise play. Like if you could serve anyone from like an individual photographer who just wants to add these sort of invisible QR codes to all their images, to sort of big companies that are cranking out content at scale. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, one of the, the interesting things about this industry, and I think one of the challenges, is that like everybody deals with digital media. Everybody deals with images, video, documents. So, if you can come up with a security solution that works, broadly, you can serve all these different, very diverse markets. And I don't know, it's a lot of fun, actually.
Nice. So obviously this comes up, the whole idea of content, its use, and proving what content was used where. This comes up a lot in AI, right? Because the whole thing with generative AI models is that they essentially hoover up content from the open web and use that to train their large language models. And talking mainly about, well, with large language models, we're talking mainly about text. But I mean, if you think about diffusion models and the imagery that they need to train on, it's obviously a big factor across media. So I guess the big question I have, and conceptually, is when this happens, when say data's hoovered up, it's watermarked with say your technology or someone else's. Like what happens in the transformative process of the AI sort of querying that data and spitting something out? Is that watermark lost? Can you, in other words, can you tell if some particular piece of training data was used in an AI through this process?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's lots of different kind of issues around generative AI and provenance.
Yeah.
And one of the issues that you're describing is training data, right? So, it's a big concern for people that are creators, photographers, artists, whatever, that, the content that they're putting out there, that's their livelihood, maybe being used in ways that they didn't intend for it to be used, particularly in these generative models. Now, the scary part isn't, okay, great, it's being used in these models, whatever, it's being read by people across the internet, what's the big deal? But a lot of these models are, learning how to replicate the types of content that they're consuming during their training, right? So, if I'm an artist and, it takes me 80 hours to put together a piece of work, that's really valuable time for me. And if somebody can just go train an algorithm that goes and, reproduces my style, that could be a big deal for me. That could have a big impact on my bottom line. Now, some artists like to embrace that sort of thing, that sort of technological change, but I think it's important to give creators, the control over the content that they're producing and, how it's being used.
Yeah, and I guess sort of what my question gets at is, I think once the watermarking is there, how does it facilitate that control in an AI world, right? And I think, and we can touch on all these things, but to me, there's a sort of a complex web of first the watermarking and the provenance, then the transformative nature of the AI, and then sort of the meta issue of, is it a kind of an honor system? What is the enforcement of such a system? Is it, there's obviously legal things that are going through the courts right now, and we're seeing that with lawsuits like the New York Times and stuff. But then there's also like just industry standard practices that are starting to emerge, or hopefully see the beginnings of emerging, right? And I'm trying to loop this back around sort of to the question, but ultimately the question is like, how is this all supposed to work? Or in Steg.AI's world, like what is sort of if everything's running smoothly and your technology is being used in the ecosystem, what does a healthy ecosystem with good enforcement look like?
Yeah, your question's big because it's a big problem, and there's a lot of different facets to it. So I'm going to try and focus on a couple of small pieces, and if it sounds like I'm meandering, I'm going to try and tie them together at the end.
It's okay. It's a meandering topic because this is why I really wanted to have you on, because I can't really wrap my head around it. So let's try to at least wrap our head around bits of it.
Okay, so in the first thing that you talked about, it was generative AI models hoovering up data for training, and that potentially rubbing some content creators the wrong way. So, there are methods that we can do where we can change the content that you're, publishing online in ways that are imperceptible, but will have a disruptive effect on the training of models.
Interesting.
So, you could almost think about it like it's a watermark that poisons a model that it's trained on.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about poisoning models this way, and the main thing I read was probably a study, and I forget where it came out from, but it looked at that it didn't really take much in the way of poisoned data to screw up a model's perception of, say, an image that is of a cat. But if your metadata calls it a dog, and you do that enough times, and I actually, you would know better than I would how many times it would take, less than you think, to sort of mess up the AI's whole concept of what is it, a cat or a dog.
Yes, you're exactly right. And then so the idea here is that, a lot of these creators feel that, look, maybe I don't want my content being used to train your model at all. Maybe I don't want to have a model that's going to try and, recreate a version of my work without my permission. But some feel differently. Some are like, yeah, you can use my artwork. That's fine. I just want to be properly compensated for it. Mm-hmm. And, the thing that's, where it gets so complicated is in commercial licensing, right? You might have a commercial license to you can publish my image on your website or use it in your story, right? No mm-hmm. problem. But it might be a totally different set of permissions and a different license to take your image and use it for training a model. It might depend what that model is going to do. So this gives the owners, the creators, that power to say, well, go ahead, use the version that's out there, but it's going to mess up your model. And if you want the real deal without any of the poisoning, then you can come to me and we can, put together a licensing agreement.
Nice. Yeah. That makes sense. Go ahead.
On kind of the other side of this is more provenance and deep fakes, that kind of side of generative AI. And, the issue here is really about understanding where content is coming from. Is it coming from an algorithm or is it coming from a camera?
And right. Sort of like prove, it's almost like these AI detectors that are trying to do this on the fly, obviously sans watermarking, or maybe in some cases with it, but watermarking adds probably a little more certainty to that. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I'd say it's more than that, actually. So there's a couple of different pieces here. Again, it's a complicated problem. But, the reason why I don't really, I'm not a big believer in these generative AI detection platforms is because, for one thing, something being a product of generative AI does not mean that it is malicious or fake.
Right.
Just like something being the product of a camera doesn't mean that it's trustworthy and real. As much as I'd like to believe that Steven Spielberg built a park with real dinosaurs in it, I know it's not true.
Right.
But, the issue is that for, the long time, we as, users, consumers online became, comfortable with the idea that, well, if something looks like an image, okay, maybe it's been photoshopped, maybe somebody's gone and cut and pasted it or something like that. But I know ultimately somewhere along the lines it came from a camera. And with the advent of generative AI, it's just not true anymore, right? So we can't rely on that feature of, hey, this looks like an image to know if this is real or mostly real. And so that's why there's a big demand now for technologies like watermarking to help understand where these things came from. And, I hope I'm not ranting too long.
No, I get it. I think what you're getting at is like a lot of AI detectors are more or less doing the first part of what you said is like, is this the product of a camera? Is this artificially generated or artificially altered? But that's not enough to know like what they really want to know is like, is this true? Or did this and to your point, where did it come from? Which would be a much better detector of like whether it's true or not. Like if it's something officially came from say, I guess what you might call a credible news source or a government agency or something, as opposed to, oh, this is just some random person on the web from some random server somewhere. So, you can tell, like, that's, again, I'm not saying making a judgment on the truth of any particular thing, but those are very clear indicators of authenticity more than like these pixels were altered once.
Yeah. I'd say that, what people really care about is the trustworthiness, right? And just knowing where something came from really helps them make their own decision as to whether or not it's trustworthy. I think your example of, did this come from a government agency or did this come from, an account with 10 followers on Twitter, can really help you figure out how much I want to dig into this. But the other piece of the problem with some of these Gen AI detectors is that, we've seen how quickly Gen AI technology, deepfake technology has advanced. It's been really, interesting from an academic standpoint. But, all of these methods rely on kind of clues. Hey, is there some statistical signature that's different about this AI generated image versus what I'm getting out of my iPhone, right? And as these algorithms continue to advance, it's going to be less and less distinguishable between, what is, coming from an algorithm versus not, what's being produced organically. So I think the big shift is going from, a mindset of, well, I just trust the content that I see because it looks realistic and, it's on a website that I like to visit or a social media platform that I like to visit, versus maybe I shouldn't trust this content unless I'm given reason to, unless I know, hey, where did this come from? And that goes for both like organic content, that comes from a camera, and synthetic content that comes from an algorithm. I just want to know, hey, where did this come from? The White House? Did this come from Eric's iPhone? Before I can make a decision as to, really how trustworthy it is.
And sort of how do you think that might play out pragmatically for sort of larger audiences? Because it sounds conceptually great. It's just that, if I'm looking at an article online and I frankly just don't have time to go and check everything, is there something along the lines of a badge or some kind of symbol that can sort of help with that? Like this image or this text is sort of verified in some way. Because, it's funny, like we're having this conversation right when the Washington Post just published something about the coming AI influence on the election. And I'm sure you've heard of the liar's dividend, right? Where now that AI is this factor and is turning these sort of deceptive practices for misinformation into for something that's essentially a commodity that anyone can do. What's happening is that people are trusting everything less, and then it's kind of like the easy thing to say is like, oh, that was AI's fault or AI probably did that. And you kind of want to be able to say something back in cases where it is true. Like, well, no, like let's point at the little green lock icon or whatever it is, and this is actually the real deal. Is that sort of where we're going?
Yeah, I think so. I think your question's really smart. So, obviously, coming up with a solution where, hey, we can use technology to see what's trustable is great, but it's actually how it's going to be implemented and delivered to people that's going to matter. So I think one of the groups that's doing a great job here is C2PA. So if you're not familiar with them, C2PA, they are the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authentication. And
okay. Interesting. Is this I know there's a few of these groups, but is this related or the same as the Content Provenance Initiative or something? That the one Adobe was very prominently promoting. Is it the same thing?
Yeah, you're probably thinking about Content Authenticity Initiative.
That's it. That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so the C2PA is like the open source standards that Adobe has built the Content Authenticity Initiative product on top of. So Adobe is like one of the main contributors to C2PA, as is like Microsoft.
Sort of like the base layer, if you will, of this idea.
Yeah, it's you could think about it a lot like JPEG, right? Like how does JPEG work? It's a set of rules for how we take an image, how we compress it, how we reconstruct it, and the whole purpose of JPEG is that hey, it works on my iPhone, it works in your browser, it works on social media. So yeah, C2PA is kind of taking the same approach here, where they've designed an open standard for everybody to use that allows for the embedding of content credentials. Basically, where does this piece of media come from? Who signed off on it? And again, it's an opt-in process. And, of course, they've smartly designed it. Steg has been a contributor to it. And they've, their support for technology like watermarking that Steg has as well. So, it's really kind of about, taking a standard like this and proliferating it across the internet such that it is, available, easy to use. And, I think the ultimate goal is to have it be almost invisible, similar to JPEG, right? Mm-hmm. When you go online and you go to a website, you don't have to know anything about how JPEG works. Your browser just loads the image and you can view it, right? I think where we're going to move to is a similar place where, for embedding information about provenance and giving users the ability to do things in a trustworthy sense, we are making the process as seamless and invisible for them. But that, is going to take some time, of course.
Well, and it seems like there's a couple phases. It sounds like we've achieved a key phase in this, which is that we have this, I guess, standard, if you want to call it that is out there. But then adopting those standards in a way that makes a difference is clearly a big step as well. So, for example, you can create a fancy new image format anytime you want, if it doesn't display on Facebook or the internet or major platforms or whatever. Like, it's just God help you, right? So it's kind of like, now the standard's out there. Is one of the next phases places like Google, Facebook, etc. see it? They're like, okay, so now what do we do with this? How do we represent this in a nice, seamless, easy way to our users, but also serves what we were just talking about, like a information ecosystem by adding some layer of integrity to it?
Yeah, I think like the strength of these types of standards increases as different groups adopt them. But this is actually one of the places where watermarking is pretty key. So we have Steg did a collaboration with a company called TruePic and another company, Hugging Face. And we created this publicly accessible thing called watermarked content credentials. And I can send you a link to it. It's pretty cool. So it's basically a text to image generator. So you type in some prompt and it uses, you can select a couple of old Stable Diffusion models. And it will return an image to you. But the image that is returned comes with a C2PA content credential, and it comes with a Steg.AI watermark that is linked to this content credential. So I can download this image, but as soon as I go and upload it to social media, a couple of things are going to happen. They're going to strip out all the metadata. They are going to compress the image, and they may not have support for C2PA currently. Mm-hmm. But so I can share this, image on social media. And then if I want to go download it, the second half of the tool is an authenticator. So I can download it and it'll actually read the watermark that's in the pixels of the image and say, hey, even though this, C2PA content credential and some of the other metadata was stripped out, we can still recover the content credentials due to the watermark. So it serves as a nice bridge for compatibility here.
I see. So that's good. That's a good, it's very clear to me now how the watermarking serves the initiative, because the fact is metadata is just super easily stripped out, and sometimes people even just do either screen captures or, to your point, like just aim your iPhone at the screen. And traditionally that's been a way to sort of get around certain things like copyright detectors and stuff. But it sounds like your tech accounts for that.
That's exactly it.
So let's move on a little bit to text, because I think this is all very intuitive with regard to imagery, but with document watermarking and text watermarking, is there some appreciable way that like, how does that work just inherently differently? Because you're obviously not logging things into the pixels, are you?
It depends. Even for documents, sometimes pixels is the way to go, but it's a harder problem, to be candid about it. So what I mean by that is, like, let's say I take a picture of, a forest or a screenshot my screen right now of you and I talking, right? Like, it's a very meaningful image to you and I. But if
very
I
meaningful.
make
Super valuable.
very, yeah, I'm going to have it framed in my office. But if I, make a couple of changes to, maybe the texture of your floor or a couple of pixels, your shirt, something like that.
I'd welcome that, by the way, but go on.
A few touch-ups. We're not going to, perceive things any differently if we do it right, if we do it smartly, right? Like, the content is the same. The entropy in images, you could say, is very high, right?
Okay.
Versus text, it's not so much. And in text, there's a lot of subtleties that really matter, right? If I were to say, okay, well, I'm going to come up with a watermarking algorithm that lets me change some words, and everybody who reads this is going to get a different copy, and they're going to be able, based on the specific words, I can track and see which copy went where, what they did with it, so on and so forth. If I say the smell of this rose is delightful, that's a very different sentence than saying the stench of this flower is good. So the connotation of words matters, which makes it a lot more difficult to kind of make, high entropy, meaningful changes to text without changing the perceived meaning. So, we've got some methods to do this that, I can't speak to in too much detail, but it is a challenging problem for that reason.
That's interesting. I like your use of the word entropy there, because it essentially, like, I think, if I'm inferring the meaning, it's like when you essentially make a copy of something in imagery that sort of you think of it as like almost like, not quite compression, but I guess it's kind of like you have it sort of suffer a certain degradation, I guess, as you do it. But anyway, go on. Maybe just elaborate a bit on what you mean by entropy in both image and text scenarios.
Maybe what I should be saying is capacity. So, okay. Our ability to add information such that we're not altering the underlying, perception of the content, whether it's an image, a video, a piece of text, something like that. But it's really how much information we can add before we start to break things.
Gotcha. Cool. One thing that I feel like watermarking has a role in maybe is the output of these generative systems as well. Because I feel like there's a problem that I keep hearing about sort of more and more, and I don't know if it's going to be a huge problem for a while now, but it's the idea of like models training on output from models. And that the more of our information ecosystem becomes AI driven and AI created, the more sort of the models are getting their own stuff fed back to them. And eventually, like, your ecosystem just sort of like the outputs just become goopier, right? Until we got nothing but goo, which is it's all AI stuff on AI stuff, and it's kind of junk. So as models sort of go out there and train on stuff, is watermarking a factor here? Is there is that really more just a sort of a system of AI detection, or is it more like could you use, I guess what I'm getting at is like watermarking on the output of these systems that would guard against that sort of result, or even other results that I'm not even thinking of?
Yeah, I think I know the work that you're referring to, where, there's been these great studies that show, if algorithms are continuously trained on the outputs of other generative algorithms, you can get really weird results. I view it actually as a security issue, right? So like one, is trying to create the best possible product or the best possible algorithm that they can, right? But part of the issue that we're facing is just the scale of data to manage has gotten huge, right? It's not, it used to be in computer vision in the field that I come from, there were a few well-established data sets, and you could trust them and you could use them for training. And that's, still true in some cases, but not in all cases. So the ability to kind of manage at scale, what is usable for training, what's trustworthy, it's ultimately the same issue. If you're trying to figure out what's good for my model, that needs, 1 billion images, or what's good for my social media users, who need to know that, what they're seeing is real. And so, information security techniques like Steg forensic watermarks are really great for this sort of thing, because we can say very definitively, hey, this is what, this image is, here's where it comes from, here's what it can be used for.
Cool. So I feel like I need to bring it back around to my original question, which I'm honestly not sure if we fully answered. And I'll just ask it again with all the context that we've just talked about, which is that if your stuff is watermarked and it is hoovered into one of these systems as training data, and then basically an answer comes out that is based in part on that training data, is the watermark detectable? And let me just stop there, because that's a very direct question, and you can say yes or no, or caveat it however you want. But I definitely have sort of follow-ups on this idea, because I think it gets it to the heart of like a lot of things that aren't yet resolved in AI and look like they're going to be pretty soon. So,
yeah, sure, it's a good question. So, there are types of watermarks that are detectable on the output, but it's a really challenging problem. Not all of Steg's watermarks are designed for this use case. Not all of our customers need us to detect, the output of a certain type of model. And, without getting, overly crushed in detail here, it really depends on, the type of model that you're going after. Is it a model that's, you're training, you have images, let's say, just to go back to that example, and I'm training an image, text to image generation algorithm. That's a very different type of output where we'd want a watermark to survive, versus I have an image classification model that's just telling me, what's in the content. You're not going to get a watermark to survive that. I mean, you can, in the sense of like a poisoning result that, like we talked about before.
Sure.
Yeah. But it's a very different problem.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is sort of maybe a meta issue, or the bigger picture issue of sort of the guidance for content creators. So if you saw the New York Times lawsuit, it's like, okay, a good chunk of it is essentially proving that their content was used in training. And there's a lot of indicators of this beyond just the examples they cited, like, oh, you can actually get to spit back articles with the right prompting. But then they also pointed at sort of statistics on Common Crawl and how prominent the New York Times is. And that's all fine for the New York Times. I'm more thinking like smaller content creators who just aren't sure, and it was hoovered up by ChatGPT because it did the whole internet. But the idea of proving it, like, is my thing part of that? It seems like there's not an easy way to tell what's in training data. Certainly AI companies aren't in a hurry to tell people. And you could sort of query things like Common Crawl or whatever, but it's getting at the whole idea, putting aside whether or not that's legal, what that question's before the courts, and we'll figure that out. Is there just some easy way to check like that your stuff was pulled into one of these things? And maybe watermarking just isn't the solution for that. I don't know. It certainly sounds like it would help on at some point in the process, if certainly if you got stuff to be revealed through the courts or whatever. But I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like, what's the guidance on someone on a smaller place? Like, was my stuff used even?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not like watermarking your content with this, type of use case in mind, and then retroactively you're trying to determine if your content was used as training data, it's a really hard problem. And I know that there are a lot of folks that kind of specialize in this thing, and I don't want to say the wrong thing here, so I want to be a little bit careful, but that's hard. It's certainly a lot more manageable of a problem if you're taking these kind of precautions by watermarking your assets ahead of time.
Cool, that makes sense. So listen, just to wrap things up here, I want to get what your thoughts are on what, if you're, say a media executive or a journalist or someone whose whole livelihood depends on content creation right now, sort of what is your guidance for them on how to survive this sort of coming AI transformation, projecting out 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and when we sort of have an AI mediated information ecosystem?
Well, I'd say that I think it's a useful framework to view generative AI as a disruptor. And what I mean by that is it's done a really good job of creating a product that is much less expensive to produce. So I think that the real value proposition that journalists have are their high standards, right? So you just can't replace somebody being on the ground, photographing in a war zone with, an AI generated interpretation, even with like the best prompt engineering and all this stuff. It's just not the same thing. So I think that where, it really makes sense to distinguish yourself is in this editorial arena. And so, I think the ways to do that are just to make it as abundantly clear, what the difference is between your high quality product versus, this cheaper product, the output of generative AI. And I think that content credentials, watermarks, not to sound like a broken record, are really good for this sort of thing, right? Because it says, hey, this came from this journalist you trust. This came from his camera. This was published on, the New York Times, a website that you really trust, versus not having that information or comparing it to something that's, coming out of an algorithm.
Cool. That's good guidance. All right. Thank you very much, Eric. All right. That has been Eric Wengrowski of Steg.AI. This is a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming by.
Okay. Thanks very much, Pete. Nice to talk to you.
Cool. You've been listening to the Media Copilot. Check us out at mediacopilot.ai. You can also follow us on Twitter at The Media Copilot. Be seeing you in the future.